For me, this starter is a little bit underdeveloped. It smells mild, like milky even. And I like a little bit more of a sharp smell at the end. One of the things that we kind of did weird with this is a very small volume in here, like a bucket. And we ended up, so we typically do a 1-2-2 refresh. We ended up, 1 2.5 2.5. So basically 1 part starter, 2.5 parts flour, 2.5 parts water. It helps balance the acid load in the starter by adding just a little bit flour, but still kind of a high level of inoculation of the base starter. We doubled the flour and water partially because it's like too little starter for this bowl, and it's mostly because we're not going all in with it. We have like a backup play in the fridge, so we kind of got to commit to this thing and then just transition to it. If you're wondering if you're ready for one of these things, you're not ready if you're only making 1 bucket of starter a day. If you're making more than 1 bucket a day, I still think that's not quite there. We're making like over 10 on a light day, and sometimes more in like our slower season right now. So we'll use a fair amount of this tank, but like everything else in this facility, it's designed to grow into and then eventually have to grow the use case. The starter in this tank is ready in 8 hours, but then it holds for longer. It basically takes the temperature and starts to drop it over time in order to sort of optimize fermentation and then get it ready to store for as long of a time as possible with kind of peak fermentation activity. My feeling is this first trial, we didn't nail it. We did well enough to mix with it because we have done a by hand starter forever. So we kind of understand what happens at the various stages of a sourdough starter. A lot of bakers would mix with this and be happy. We like to mix with a more mature starter. So basically, we'll adapt for this mix today. I'm now going to discharge the starter and see how that goes. One of my fears is that it really doesn't want to come out because of how little there is in there. So this could work very poorly. I might have to loosen it up in there a little bit. Trying to figure out how to discharge it with this little amount in it. I mean, certainly the problem is the consistency of the resulting starter, which it was mixed for 30 minutes at the beginning. The first cycle in this thing is a 30-minute stir. And we've never built a starter with such a stir. Like at most we'll hand mix for a couple minutes, so it's way less developed. This starter pretty much developed all of its like structure, so it's definitely more of a dough than an actual starter. And the question is, how do we now get it to come out? It's like having a completely new toy. You gotta figure out. Wow. This is just something else, guys. Something else. I kind of want to give up on the rest of that stuff that's in there. We have some buffer, right?
Yeah.
Okay. That can just be in the next batch. Look at it. It's like stuck to the back corner. I mean, it is bubbly. It just looks very different than anything we've ever put in bread before. And this like level of dough on my arm has not been experienced since the hand mixing days. I mean, I'm all too familiar with this sensation because just a few years ago, that's what we did with every single batch of bread. And so, you know, you just end up spending a lot more of your time during the day on one activity, mixing. People sort of ask ask the question of how worthwhile it is to stay in that mode, because hand mixing was definitely a point of pride for us when we were doing it. We're doing this. But at the end of the day, you also have to ask yourself, what proportion of time do you want to spend doing what? Do you want to spend all your time mixing dough, or do you want to spend your time testing something new, you know, that lets you develop your overall skill of baking? If I can get a really good result with a mixer, and I can afford a mixer, and I'm working at scale, then I personally would rather spend more time on new ideas and less time on just the same old repetitive motion of mixing. I'd rather be able to mix and laminate personally. But I think that there's people out there that would rather, you know, make a smaller amount of bread and find a way to sort of just stay solo and do that. But that bread's going to hopefully cost a lot more because that person is spending far more time per loaf, you know, making it. If you do the math, like if you do one loaf at home and you spend 3 hours on this one loaf, what's the value of that bread? What is 3 hours of your time? And then spread through the whole day, where you know you have to start in the morning and end at night, and you're kind of dancing around this dough all day. I think like the small cottage baker is doing a form of that in order to get forward in their new business. They're sacrificing their own time to sort of build something that can grow in value. We had a couple of years like that at the garage. Like the first couple of years that we were doing this, there wasn't much in the form of value to prove, because once you did the math, you spent far more time on it than the product itself was able to be sold at. So the original owner, he found a way to make it work for a little while, but he had another job as a chef, and so he had to kind of dual wield for almost the whole time that I knew proof existed. He tried kind of going all in on proof, but at the time the bakery couldn't really afford staffing, and so I think that was just really hard. I remember the first one of the first few days that I worked with him, he was just telling me about how the last time he had a day off was something like 5 months in the past, and he just looked really tired. You know, back then Friday was like start in the morning early and end Saturday afternoon after the farmer's market. There's really no stopping. And it took basically a year and a half of that to reach a point where we could take it a little bit slower. I'm basically trying a new ratio to fit the way that this machine is functioning. So for one, I'm starting with really hot water because this machine has a cool down function. So it's going to cool it down to 85. Yesterday we cooled it down too much, which really prevented kind of that base fermentation from occurring. So 15,000 water is where we're at. I'm just going to go ahead and put it right into the machine. I'm going to put this back on its first segment. And it's starting a stirring of this water. It's actively actually cooling it. Now my job is to get the flour in that goes with it. We also did this wrong, I should say, yesterday. You know, if I'm being honest, we put the starter in right at the start, which shouldn't really make much of a difference, but I mean, we do have a really weird result, without a doubt. So maybe there's something to it. So sticking to the ratio, the whole idea is I want to introduce more water now because of what happened. If it had come out more like the starter that we keep, then I wouldn't be doing this right now. But it came out really strong. But now I'm essentially going to make this into a very passive process. I have 28 minutes to add all this flour in. Where are we at on the other items? Are you prepping water for sourdough yet?
That's exactly what I'm doing.
Currently filling up this water for this bowl, and I'll kind of put flour in as well as we go. But putting flour in first makes it stick to the bottom of the bowl. Putting water in first leaves a cleaner bowl. I'll work a little bit more of this flour in. Still have soup, which is pretty much what I want. So I had this same thing happen yesterday where I want to get to 85, but I'm actually getting into the high 70s, and I'm using pretty hot water, like 110. It's got a cooling system, so it's just cooling very well. But I think that's also a symptom of how little we're still using it. So in my case, just because of how small this batch is for this big vat of refrigerator, we might have to really crank up the volume or the temperature of the water. Might have added a bit of time, but I was running it on kind of the manual setting, whereas in auto it will just immediately turn around. We have this theory that if we mix just for a minute or two in one direction, it incorporates nicely, but then a little bit of time in the other direction really gets rid of the final clumps. So we're almost done with the auto lease here. And then basically Logan's gonna take over this, this mixing process through the finish line. I'm gonna move on to baking bread once I check and see where the oven's at in the first place. So this is auto lease level. As we're kind of learning with the other machine, it's just important to use tools correctly. Just because you have a nice mixer doesn't mean you don't scrape down the bowl. That fermentation tank, you know, I'm learning how to use it. And I think that that's fine. There's definitely a period for everything. There's a period where you're less comfortable with something and trying to figure it out. And I think the way you function in those periods is just a matter of like your risk tolerance. You know, if you need a little bit more safety, then have a little bit more backup. Like in this case, with the sourdough starter, we're making a lot, I guess, in this tank today, but we're gonna keep a manual backup so that we have options of what to go to until it's been tested to work. And once we make decent bread with it, well, the stakes get a little bit lower and we can take greater risk. So we're gonna check on the oven and see how it's doing in terms of its warm up. Feels warm over here.